Well, hello and welcome to Diana's field practices portion video so that you can actually kind of see how we're going to collect the EcoPlot data. If you look around, you'll notice that we're in a kind of partial cutting regime. So somebody's come in here and a lot of the area's been logged. So it's a highly disturbed area, and it's a great place to do as an example because you're going to find a lot of early cereal plants kind of coming into the site, as well as what was here when it was a mature overstory stand. So sometimes the plants can kind of play tricks with you, but we'll get down to the soils and the edaphics of the site, and hopefully we'll be able to figure out what ecotype this is. I'm going to hang my ribbon. Of course, I've figured out an area here that I think is reasonably representative, and I have a very obliging stick here. But let's say you've been asked for silvicultural purposes to come in here and just rip a plot so that they know what to plant, what stocking standards to apply. So of course I'm going to put in my plot ribbon, and I'm just going to put in plot 1, my name, or the company name, and the name of the block and the date. Block fun to log. DG, and then today is the lovely date. I'm going to say August 1. I think it's actually July 31st. July 31st. Okay, here we go. Okay, now you're going to see that this was a harvester type of logging system and forwarders, so there are a lot of disturbed sites, like tracked disturbed sites. So I am just going to try and push over some of the logging debris for my soil pit. I'm going to try and get some undisturbed ground so that we can really get a good look at the LFH layer. But we know we do have a lot of tracked areas in this block. So that's what we'll do. So the first thing I'm going to do, turn on my Garmin. Got my Garmin. So there we go. There's my location in UTMs, and there's my elevation. So those are the two things I'm going to get off of my Garmin and put onto my handy dandy field card, which I'm going to do on this example in a paper format. So the first thing I'm going to do is licensee, block, fun to log. This is actually plot 1. My name, because I'm the surveyor. Oops, can't spell my name apparently. And it's 23, and it's 07, and it's 31. Now for my location, I like to put it up at the top so that I can see what I'm doing. So I've got 501021, and then I got 598 6030. There we go. Location. Now elevation 753. I'm going to put it here. So there's some easy information already loaded. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in this really critical section in here, right? That's the first most important section. And of course, I've already referred to my maps and everything, so I know I'm in the SBS MK1. I know that part already. While we were walking, we've been coming up a slow incline, going up a slow bit of a hill. It's not much, and then it's kind of leveling out here. And so kind of like almost like a plateau with a little bit of sloping downward, and that's because plot 2 is actually in a wetter, richer site. That's a different video. So I get to look at the slope position. So do I see this as upper crest, middle, lower toe depression? No, I see these as, if anything, it's kind of like and there's no mountains around me. It stays fairly level, So I'm actually going to say this is level ground. And remember in the course I talked about how level's a little tricky. So, but this is definitely level slope. And it's not hummocky. I could walk 100 meters that way, you'd still see me, right? So we're gonna call it straight because its undulations are pretty gentle. And I'm gonna actually say, when we're talking about short and long, remember we're talking about 150 meters mesoscale. So basically I could walk 150 meters and it's more or less the same topography. 200 meters, 300 meters, it's the same topography. I've already typed out that other type, that plot 2. We're in plot 1 here. So I'm gonna say it's long and it's uniform. And there's no gullies. And I'm gonna say because of that length, it's continuous. It's fairly continuous. I'd have to go quite a ways to hit that plot 2 back there. Okay, so now my next 2 things are slope and aspect. And remember, one of the things I said was, you know, if your slope is really minor, you could call it all. And that's usually 5% or less. Like if you're at a slope of 0 to 5%, chances are you don't really have an aspect. So you can say your aspect is all. And I mean, I'm not pulling out, I could pull out this clinometer and I will, and I'll set a ribbon. But my problem from this point is, where's my actual aspect? It is slightly sloping this way. So very, very gentle slope that way. So I'll hang a ribbon over there and then I'm gonna check it with my clinometer, just like we do in cruising, where you know you hang a ribbon about 15 meters away. If you're by yourself, if you're with somebody, they can just stand over there. Okay. So 3%. So that's what I'm going to write down, 3%. That's my slope. And I'm going to say my aspect is all. Okay. You don't need to say that it's at 3%. That's fine. It's a pretty gentle slope. Okay. But just so you know, that is a southwesterly direction. Okay, cool. So now we've got this whole top section done. Other than site series, moisture, and nutrient, those are the last things we're probably going to fill in. Now, they give you the plants and all this information next, but I want you to fill that in last. This is the first part you fill in, and then I want you to flip it over, and the next part I want you to fill in is the soils section. Soils and humus form. So let's get on to that. Well, through the handy-dandy use of technology, video editing, I can show you. This is a really great silky knife, and you can get them at IRL and other field supply stores. They're great for helping you if you've got a plot hole that's full of roots. So you just come in here and try and remove the roots without injuring yourself. Very important. Okay. So, like I said, you should have a minimum of 3 pictures. Definitely the stand, the vegetation, and the soil pet on. Attach those photos. And the next section we're going to do is right here, and that is your humus form. That's the section we're going to work on now. Now I'm going to show you the way that you infer your fermenting layer so that you get your LFH properly documented. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the total depth of our organic layer. Remember what I said, it can't be any mineral soil. As soon as there's mineral soil, you're in an AH layer. So it's a little bit variable here, but when I look at the soil, I could see my AH layer goes quite high. So I've actually got, see that's organic, and almost here it right away becomes mineral. So if I look at this side of my LFH, I'm looking at about 4 to 5 centimeters. And if I look on this side, probably looking at about 3 to 4 centimeters. So you can compromise on your pit, and you can go, okay, I'd say on average, the total depth of my LFH is 4 centimeters. Okay, that's the total depth. Okay, so a fermenting layer, like we said, is all that organics that are held tightly by mycelium. So they're very difficult to kind of measure and interpret. So what your best bet is to look at the litter. And here's litter, like you can see it here, hey? You can see little bits of spruce and pine sort of. Oh God, what are they called? Stuff from pine cones and spruce cones. And balsam cones. You can see the conifer needles and detritus, right? Before you hit that kind of just below the fermenting layer, which is kind of bound more by mycelium and is like way more decomposed before you hit the humus, and the humus is kind of like, looks like compost. So when I look at this, I see that my organic layer is pretty much a centimeter. It's a centimeter on this side. I can't even measure it. Here it's probably closer to about 1.5 centimeters before I hit that kind of fermenting layer. Almost between 1 and 2 centimeters. So that's okay. Once again, you can compromise here and go, litter is 1.5. Okay? The next one, we're not going to measure the fermenting layer. We're just going to go in and we're going to see how much compost we can find, like the humus layer, and it looks like it almost immediately goes into an AH. I'm not really seeing much of an H layer. Let's see this side. This side, I'm gonna say, that's minerals. There's very little. It goes right into the minerals right away. I'd almost be tempted to say there's zero humus. It goes from litter, fermenting, right into an AH layer. There's virtually no humus. So I'm going to say 0. Now, we know that our total depth is 4. 4 minus 1.5 is going to give us fermenting layer. Okay? So that's 3.5. And that's the depth of our fermenting layer. Okay, so when we look at it, right, it doesn't come off like a toupee. It's quite friable. So remember when we talked about if the most largest thing is your fermenting layer, it's a more. Typically, in this case, when we see how friable it is, you know, in forestry, we often call things a more motor because it's not like a full motor. But in this case, I would actually be more comfortable calling it a more motor because it's got characteristics of a motor. If you called it a motor, that's fine. I know for diagnostics, they look at those. They'll ask you that, and in this case, if it's like this and it's borderline, I would say for the interior, specifically the northern interior, If it's already starting to look yummy like this, go ahead, call the motor, because it's definitely richer. I mean, it's breaking down materials pretty quickly, right? So, and the AH is really up high, which means there might, like for sure there's insects in here, not just mycelium. And I couldn't even show you a good mycelium in here. Let's see if I can. Oh yeah, there. Can you guys see those little white lines? That's mycelium binding it together. But you can see the mineral soil already, right? So it's a very productive, more than typical, because it's not coming off as a toupee. So anyways, okay, so now we know we've got basically more or less more motor or a motor. We're gonna take the total depth of our soil pit. I struggled a bit to get down there. It's got a definite dense BT layer. So I wanna get this. Now remember, when we're gonna measure our pit depth, it's to the bottom of your humus form. So you start the measurement at the bottom, measure to where your mineral soil ends at the top, which in my case is 37 centimeters. You're not always gonna get down, oh man, that's hard to write. You're not always gonna get down to 60 centimeters. Okay, 37 centimeters. And that's where you put it. I'm sorry, my handwriting's so terrible. That's the total depth of your soil pit. Okay, and the rooting depth is right to the bottom, like 37 centimeters. I've got 37 plus, because I do have a root coming right up. So I know that, okay? So we can't figure out drainage until we really look at our soil. So what do we have to start? So let's take a look, do a little destructive sampling. We know when we look around the soil pit, if anything, I would say, like, because and I don't know if you can see this with the color, you could see this kind of mineral soil that's that color compared to, let's take the next layer down. Can you see that color difference? See, so this A layer is not white. It's definitely darker. It's chocolatey. So we're gonna call that an AH. It's an enriching layer. It's an AH. So we know our top layer is an AH. How deep is it? Now we gotta do some examining. It goes lighter there. So up to there, over here. Goes down a little deeper. Take a couple measures. What do I have here? 10 centimeters. Ooh. I want to say 8.5 centimeters. So let's compromise at about 9.5. So I go 0 to 9.5, which is 9.5. If you have the digital version, obviously you can't do that, but it's nice to be able to do it when you got the paper version. Let's get and I don't texture my AH layer. There's too much organics in it. So now I got to figure out my B layer. So what I noticed wasn't so much a change in color, but I noticed a change in this layer being quite a bit more friable than the bottom layer. The bottom layer, and I'll try and get you guys a chunk of it. This is that bottom layer. It's much more platy compared to this upper layer. You can even see a color difference. You see the color difference? So we're gonna take a look at this layer. And I do see some weak mottling through it. It's hard to see, but in situ, like in the pit, let's see if I can pull out something where you guys can see there's kind of mottling evident. Oh man, it's gonna be hard because of the roots. But can you see there was a stripe of kind of white and then this kind of more yellowy gray. So there's definitely some weak mottling in this pit with this color of this type. And it's not a bright color, it's a pretty basic color. So I'm gonna call this a BM, right? Because it's definitely a B layer. And I'm gonna texture it. So when I sift it through my fingers, and you can use the texture triangle, but it's got a little dampness in it, so I can kind of play around with it. It's not really ribboning. There's a little clay in there, but definitely not enough to really play around with it. So if we pull out the texture triangle, I'm definitely below 20% clay. Okay. A couple of ways we can do this. We can look at the texture triangle. I don't know if you can read that properly. But one of the things you can do, like if you're me, is you can just look that you can see at the bottom is sand, at the top is clay, right? And I know that I've got less than 20% clay, right? And I've got literally no sand, like almost no sand. So I'm definitely, if you look at how big silty loam is, I'm definitely within the scope of a silty loam, right? How I confirm that typically, I don't endorse this, but this is what I do, is I'll take a chunk of it. There's clay in this. And my tongue definitely picks it up better than my fingers do. But you could also run the test here where you start less than 50%, yes. Moderate cast, easily non-sticky to slightly sticky. It's not even that, it's like a really weak cast, but let's say moderate cast. Okay. So there's silt, very gritty, nope. Silt loam, gritty to very gritty, and I wouldn't say strong cast. So it's not a silty clay loam. It's not really making much of a cast. It's not ribboning. So it is a silty loam. So that confirms it using that table. Okay, so what we know is now I got to get my depth. So at some point in time it gets quite platey and the color shifts. So let me just figure out where that is. It's like a subtle progression. I actually want to say it stops it around here. So I'm just going to get that measurement, guys. And that's just feeling it. And then I go to the bottom of my H layer and I get 13 centimeters. So now I know I have a BM and I go from 9.6 to 13 centimeters down, right? So that's 22.6. And I know it's a silty loam. There's no plasticity. I'll do the coarse fragments in a bit. I'm going to get this lower BT layer. And I don't need to think about it much because I had to dig at it. And you can see it's much more platey. So let's take a big chunk of that platey material, because what we want to do once we find it is we want to pull it up. You can see the different color, but we're looking for models now, you know, and look at that. You could see it's not super compacted. It's definitely platey. It's a little bit more compacted. You might not even call that a BT. You might look at it and go, okay, it was hard to dig out. It's down there. I might just call it a B2. You could call it a B2. It is definitely a little bit more, it's definitely a bit of a struggle to get through it. Either way, if you're a silviculture forester, you'd probably just call it a BT layer just so that we know we've got this, you know, layer. And if maybe you were in a site where you wanted to plant Doug fir, you might want to go in there and do some site prep. But very weak models again, if anything. And just to do a little texturing, on this stuff. Let's try this. Feels really silty. It's platier, but I don't think the texture's changed much. If anything, I'd say it's a little siltier. So then the question is it a pure silt, right? So can I get it to form with the little bit of moisture that's in it, right? Even a little worm. Now, one of the things I want to caution you about is bringing a bunch of water and really forcing it and trying to make worms out of it. I've seen that a lot of people do that, and sometimes you can even get pretty silty stuff to make a worm. Like the whole point is with the certain amount of water that's in it right now, if it's got a certain amount of clay in it, like over 25-30%, it will start to worm already. And it's just not doing it. It's just not doing it. I know there's a clay component in there, but again, it's less than 20%, and it's just really, really silty. It's like a pure silt. And we could do it again it's the same thing. You could just run it on the chart. It would probably take you to silty loam or silt. I would almost say that this, I'm going to call it a BT. I'm going to call it a silt. And it goes all the way from 22.6 to 37 centimeters, right? Can you pause? And I'm such a genius in math. That's like 14.4, whatever. 14 centimeters of BT layer, and probably goes down more if you want to fight through that. So, seasonal soil factors. There was some weak modeling, so you could just say weak models. Okay, so seasonally, it'll be either wet, but sometimes it'll be dry. Okay. So very weak. See, it says seepage or models. You can go yes, and it's as early as 10 centimeters down. Okay, very weak models. No carbonates, no water restricting layer. There is kind of a BT dense material. It's a weakly dense, but whatever. And you could say that starts at 22.6 centimeters depth. No sands and gravels, no fragmental, and to the best of what we can see, no root restricting layer either. So let's do coarse frags. So in the top one, I gotta tell you, okay, so normally what I would do is I take a big pile of soil in my hand, right? I got this big root wad with me, so you'll have to bear with me, guys. Okay, oh yeah, look at that, beautiful, look at that color. Okay, so when I do it, I sift it in my hand and I think, okay, my hand is 100%, and I try and modify it with what I dug up. Okay, so there were 0 coarse frags in that, and there was like literally no coarse frags in what I dug up. So, and then I could tell you the same for the bottom one as well. 0 coarse frags. So in both cases, I got 0 and 0 coarse frags. So, you know, a little higher bulk density soil. Okay. So in terms of soils, I'm going to say it's a Brunasol. Okay, but it's sometimes they'll say a Luvasolic Brunasol, but whatever, it's a Brunasol. And the landform parent material, I would say, is some kind of fluvial, even if it's old fluvial. Okay, and then there's no bedrock lithology, obviously, in this one, because there's no coarse fragments. Right? Okay, cool. So, what's our drainage? We've got silty loams to silts. We've got a fairly flat topography, and we got no coarse fragments. So I'd say it's moderately well drained. Now, let's talk about level topography. So remember we said level topography is tricky because you got to think about even beyond the mesoscale. Is this site surrounded by mountains where seasonally a bunch of water and snow or whatever is coming down here and might make a large level area quite wet? No. Okay, in fact, if anything, if you were to walk quite a large distance, you'd get these slow little depressions that go down into wetlands. So what we have here isn't a site that's going to be excessively dry, like in some places where you have a level plain and it drops off into a cliff type area. And it's not really wet because we don't have a bunch of surrounding big mountains. So we know it's going to put us somewhere in the standard 3 to 4, maybe to 5, like it's around in that zone. But it's moderately well draining. So let's now stop before we even look at the plants, because remember what I said, this is a partially logged area. The plants could be skewing us one way or another. What we're going to do now is we're going to go look at the guidance specific for this land management handbook on how we determine soil moisture and soil nutrient regime, because we should know our nutrient and moisture regime based on just the data we just collected now. All the plants are going to do is verify it for us. Okay? One of the great things about being in a clear-cut situation is the sun reflection on my iPad. So we're in Land Management Handbook 24, and you always want to get whatever land management handbook you're working with, and you want to utilize the grids that they have. In another demo I have on the coast, we're using the most up-to-date grids for Haida Gwaii, and they're brilliant. They're absolutely brilliant. They work so well for those ecosystems. So we're going to use the ones for Land Management Handbook 24 because that's where we're in the SBS MK1. Okay, so we're going to start off with soil moisture regimes. And the first thing it's going to do is it's going to ask us if we're on the ridge, okay, mid-slope, lower, or flats, okay? And we're not in a lower slope situation. We're on level ground, okay? And it wants to know, are you in a kind of an alluvium area, right? And it kind of feels that way because we don't have the coarse fragments. And remember, alluvium could be like fluvial deposit. So that's fine. Let's say yes. Is there a water table present or glade soil? Absolutely not. So it already wants to push us over into a 5, which we know is slightly wetter than zonal, which is a 4, okay? If we said no to alluvium, let's see where it puts us. Soil particle coarse? No. Soil particles fine, okay? So what is a soil particle that's fine? And that's when it has, let's see if I can find that. Fine is described as silty or clayey with less than 20% coarse frags. Well, you know what? It is definitely silty, especially at below. Okay, so when it says soil particle fine, we have to say yes. Water table present? No. Puts us in a 4 to 5. So either way, and this is what's great about these tables, is even if you're not sure, you can bounce around and it'll generally put you in the right location anyways. They're pretty forgiving tables. Okay, so we know we're in a 5, possibly a 4 to 5. So now I just got to find, where's the nutrient regime. So here we have the relative soil nutrient regime if you're running with 1993 version of Land Management Handbook 24. So it's got one for coarse textured, moderately coarse to medium textured, and moderately fine to fine textured. So we're going to go with moderately fine to fine textured. High coarse fragments, very shallow soil, shallow rooting depth. No. moderate to low coarse fragments without restricted root depth. That kind of sounds like us. And then they've got it broken down between a more humus form and a motor or mull humus form. And that's what they break down between medium and rich, okay? Remember I said we're kind of a more motor? So we're gonna be medium, but we have to keep in mind we could be slightly rich, right? The AH layer, typically when you're in other parts of the interior, when you're starting to get an AH layer that's over 5 centimeters, you're starting to look a little on the richer side. So we might stick with the motor and say it's a little on the rich side. Not very rich, just rich. Okay, so now we can go to, so the first thing we want to do is we want to put that on our card. And how we do that is we go C to D, and then we want to go 4 to 5. Because that's kind of where we're looking at right now. Okay, so through the magic of technology, we're going to flip up the grid, the adaphic grid for the SBS MK1. And if you look here, you can see that between C to D, 4 to 5, we're really only looking at 3 particular ecotypes, 01, 07, and 08. And I'm pretty sure we can roll out the 08 right away because there is no Devil's Club here. So it really comes down to, even though, Devil's Club, even dead Devil's Club, would still be here after logging. And it's just not here. So we know we're between an 01 and an 07. So what we then do is we start to document all of the plants that we have here. So I'm going to go through the process of doing that right now. So I walked around my 20 by 20 representative plot and I documented all the species that I see onto my plot card, and I'll show you that in a bit. But basically, and I did the 7-letter Latin wording, right? Because, you know, a lot of these plants have lots of common names, and you'll find that a common name used in one land management handbook will be different common name in another land management handbook in a different part of BC. So really, I can't emphasize this enough. Get really comfortable using the Latin. Anyways, so what do we have on site? We've got Clintonia uniflora, which is that Queen's Cup in northern speak. And it's here and it's abundant, and typically in our area, that's a fairly good indicator of more zonal sites. We did see one lady fern, but there's also quite a bit of oak fern here, Gymnocarpium dryopterus. We got about 5%, and you can see in my book, which is really, really handy, my booklet has the cover kind of circle images, which makes it really handy for me when I'm out here and I'm trying to estimate crown closures. So there was a little bit of Tiarella, just like a foam flower, and lots of viburnum, which is the cranberry, bush cranberry, and twinberry. So I got Lunicera involucrata, and I got about 7% on that. So I've documented all my plants. So let's see how that looks on my where'd I put it? On the element occurrence ranking, so I can figure out what this ecotype would be. And so if we look at the 01 and 07, one of the differences between an 01 and an 07 is Devil's Club. There's no Devil's Club here. Another difference is 01 has showy aster. We saw maybe 1. So it's here, but it's definitely not abundant. Another thing with the 01 is Queen's Cup is very abundant, and it's not as abundant in the 07. And I would actually say there's quite a bit of Queen's Cup in here. You got to remember, it's been logged over, and the Queen's Cup is still abundant here. So it's kind of tipping me towards an 01 site, but let's keep going. Oak fern. So in an 07, it's really abundant, and it's a little bit abundant, or it's present but not abundant in an 01. And I'm kind of feeling that vibe here, that there's oak fern here, but not in any great kind of presence. So what else do we have? What was another one of our indicators? Was twinberry. So if we look at Lonicera, it's equivalent presence in an 07 and an 01. Another one we had was viburnum. It really comes down to the prevalence of the Queen's Cup and the not so much presence of oak fern that's going to push me towards an 01 rather than an 07. So my final design is 01 for this site. I also took the time to document there is alder here, and that we're going to expect some vigorous deciduous ingress, which is already occurring. And I wrote down the species, and I did an estimate on the amount of coarse woody debris that's lying down everywhere. There's also some deciduous. So, next thing, now I figured out the ecotype. That's only part of the game. Now I have to walk through the block and determine how much of this area falls into this 01 type. So I know what this topography and mesoscale looks like. So as I'm walking, I'm going to be looking for absolutely changes in the vegetation. However, I'm going to be looking at changes in aspect, slope. There could be some kind of visible shifts in the soils. It could all of a sudden get quite rocky. So that's what I'll be looking at. For now, I'm just gonna finish filling out my card. Remember, when we go out timber cruising, we're only capturing the layer 1 trees. Obviously, the layer 1 trees were logged here, so we kind of want to get a sense of what's been left behind. So if I think about my plot, I can stand here and I just imagine a 4-meter radius around myself. If you're not comfortable doing that and trying to get a representative sample of what's here on the landscape, you can by all means pull out a BAF prism and use a BAF prism. So for me, I just try and picture what I've got for stems per hectare for each layer, tree layer, species, and the amounts. And then I kind of look around and ask myself if that's fairly representative, right? So, but I picked this plot because it is fairly representative. We've got slightly denser areas, but then we've got open areas. This one was kind of an in-between, so I think it's a good place for me to do my representative sample. So here we go. I'm going to count total amount of trees here that are 12.5 centimeters DBH or greater, which would put them in a layer 1 condition. So I've got 1, and that one's out, and that one's out. So I'd say that if I look around, I'd say it's too mature per plot. So what have I got? This one's an aspen. Oh, that's a dead cottonwood. But I'd say, yeah, those are all birches. Okay, so for mature, I'd say aspen, 50, cottonwood, 50. Okay. and I got 2. So 2 times 200 would be 400 stems per hectare. Might be a slight exaggeration, so I'll go 350 as my estimate. Okay. And I can even write their average height. Ooh, some of them are tall. But where I'm looking at, I'd say about 25 meters. For the purposes of an SP, you don't have to get deadly accurate. It's just so that if we do any kind of silvicultural, in this case it would be post-logging silvicultural work, they have a sense of, in this case, wildlife danger trees, potential hazards, that sort of thing. Next is my poles. So those are anything that are 7.5 centimeters DBH to 12.5 centimeters DBH. So what have I got? I'd say 1, and it's a balsam. Okay. Ooh, that one's like, I want to say 16 meters. And that gives me about 200. Again, I think it's an overestimate overall. So I'm going to drop that down. Instead of 200, I'll say 150. Saplings. 1.3 meters height to 7.5 centimeters DBH. And that gives me 1, 2. Actually, just realized I have to change that. My bad. I just missed a tree. Uh-oh. That's 50. And then spruce, 50. I'll still stick with 150. So there we go. Okay, sapling. 1, 2, 3. Not 1, 2. 2. Is that a good average? 2. Yes, so we'll stick with 2. And what are they? We got balsam. So that's balsam 100%. Again, let's say 250. I would drop that down to 250. And their average height is about 3 meters. And then regen is everything below my chest height. So what have I got? I know I got a lot of deciduous. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'm going to say 10. They're mostly all cottonwoods. I'm going to say they're all cottonwoods. So I got ATC, got 10, 100, and I got 10 of them. So 10 times 200 is 2,000. I don't think that's an exaggeration. It's quite dense in some areas. I'd say 2,000. And their height, I'm going to say is about 0.7 of a meter, 70 centimeters. So you can see we've got a huge surge in deciduous coming up here. Okay, layer conditions. Mature, deciduous, overstory. And it's a combination of, I'd say, aspen, then cottonwood, then birch. Because, you know, I've only got a couple of birch, but they're outside of my plot point here. I'd say you got about 30% birch, you've got about 40% cottonwood, no, I'd say 30% cottonwood, and you got 40% aspen. That might even be a bit of an exaggeration. Cool. And that is it, other than filling in my soils for operational purposes. I am done. My cards are done. I have determined this site is 01. I can put my equipment away, fill up my hole, keep on trucking. One other thing, and you'll notice this on the 39B cards when you're doing stratum information, is walking through here, we definitely heard the sound of an unusual hawk, a broad-winged hawk. And there's apps to help you identify plants. There's apps to help you identify animals. So we definitely didn't get dive bombed by the hawk, but it's important information to say, hey, there's a hawk here, because you never know if you might hit a goshawk, which is a highly endangered species of hawk. And right by my plot here, not too far off, is quite a bit of moose dung. So we know the area is at least seasonally heavily utilized by moose. And that's really good information to add into your SP cards. If you see any evidence of cattle use, cattle dung, that's really going to inform silviculture, because that's a whole other cake layer of troubles. So, and any kind of pathogens that you're seeing on the stems and roots, especially of residual trees, right? All I'm seeing is evidence of selective logging. And now with the dry summer that we've had, you can see now the stands opened up. A lot of the understory trees, they're quite burnt because they've got shade needles. So this is all really good, useful information. And in terms of the amount of brush that's on the ground for any kind of planting activities. All this information, just write it. There's lots of spare room in your SP notes that you could write all this additional information, and it's all dependent on very specifically what you're out here collecting data for. But don't forget to add that information. The more information you add into your eco card, the easier it is for silviculture foresters and operational foresters to make plans, and make plans that are site specific. Thanks guys, I'm gonna keep going.